Hey, fourth and fifth graders, we are still reading Flora and Ulysses by Kate D. Camillo, and we are on chapter 4. And last week we started the book where the little girl is watching from her window and she sees that her neighbor has this crazy vacuum that is vacuuming up everything in the backyard, including a squirrel. And so she's really worried about it. So she goes over to the squirrel, and here's the picture. So she sees the poor little squirrel, and this is what happens. Flora. So Flora's the little girl. And then we'll find out who Ulysses is. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, for a cynic, I am a surprisingly helpful person. She went out the back door. Her mom called to her. She said, where are you going, Flora Belle? Flora did not answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickmans in a single bound. Move out of my way, said Flora, and she gave Miss Tickman a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and she shook it. Nothing happened. She shook harder, and the squirrel popped out the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur. It was vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered, his chest rose and fell and rose again, and then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt. She put her finger on the squirrel's chest. At the back of each issue of the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comics was entitled Terrible Things That Can Happen to You. As a cynic, which means she looks for the bad in everything. That's what a cynic is. Flora found it was wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable thing could happen next? Terrible things can happen to you detailed what action to take in inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happens more often than you suppose. Some plastic fruit is extremely realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver, do you guys know what that is? It's like when somebody's choking and you push up on their chest. On your elderly Aunt Edith if she chokes on a stringy piece of steak or at an all-you-can-eat buffet. What to do if you're wearing striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descends upon you. Run, locusts love stripes. And of course, how to administer everyone's favorite CPR. Terrible Things Can Happen to You did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. I'll figure it out, said Flora. What will you figure out, said Mrs. Tickman. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down, put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted really funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say that it tasted exactly like squirrel, fuzzy, damp, and slightly nutty. Have you lost your mind, said Mrs. Tickman. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth. She pushed down on his small little chest and started to count. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things went blank and black, and then into this blank blackness there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. What's that? Said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. Okay, said the squirrel, you bet. He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise, and the squirrel heard a voice. This voice was counting. The light receded. That means it left. Breathe, the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and the squirrel returned. Well, he's breathing, said Mrs. Tickman. Yes, said Florida, he is, and she felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over on his stomach. He raised his head, and his eyes were glazed. For heaven's sake, said Mrs. Tickman, look at him. She chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. She kept on laughing, and laughed, and laughed, and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you, advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it or something with a stick. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Mrs. Tickman's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky, and Mrs. Tickman continued to laugh hysterically. And Flora Belle Buckman started looking around the Tickman's backyard for a stick. The soul of a squirrel is the next chapter. The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt larger, roomier. It was as if doors in the dark room of his self, doors that had never been existed, had suddenly swung wide open. Everything was was shot through with meaning and purpose and light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel, and he was very hungry. So Flora and Mrs. Tickman noticed at the same time. "The squirrel," said Flora. "The vacuum cleaner," said Mrs. Tickman. Together they stared at the Ulysses 2000X and at the squirrel, who was holding it over his head with one paw. "Can this be?" said Mrs. Tickman. The squirrel shook the vacuum cleaner. "That can't be," said Mrs. Tickman. "You already said that," said Flora. "I'm repeating myself?" "You're repeating yourself." "Maybe I have a brain tumor," said Mrs. Tickman. It was certainly possible that Mrs. Tickman had a brain tumor. Flora knew from reading terrible things that can happen to you, that a surprising number of people were walking around with tumors in their brains and didn't even know it. That was the thing with tragedy. It was just sitting there, keeping you company, waiting, and you had absolutely no idea. This was the kind of helpful information you could get from the comics if you paid attention. The other information was absorbed from the regular reading of comics, most particularly from the regular reading of The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. Was that possible that things happened all the time? Okay, so here's the picture. And this is why they're freaking out. Because look at the squirrel. He's holding up the vacuum with one hand and shaking it, which is kind of crazy. Okay, the other kind of information that you absorb from so I could throw that. For instance, superheroes were born of ridiculous and unlikely circumstances: spider bites, chemical spills, planetary dislocation, and in the case of Alfred T. Slipper, from accidental submersion in an industrial-sized vat of cleaning solution called incandesto. The cleaning professional's hard-working friend. "I don't think you have a brain tumor," said Florida. "There might be another explanation." "Uh-huh," said Mrs. Tickman. "What's the other explanation?" "Have you ever heard of incandesto?" "What?" said Mrs. Tickman. "Who?" said Flora. "Incandesto is a who. He is a superhero." "Oh, right," said Mrs. Tickman. "And your point is?" Flora raised her right hand. She pointed with a single finger at the squirrel. "Surely you're not implying," said Mrs. Tickman. The squirrel lowered the vacuum cleaner to the ground. He held himself very still. He considered both of them. His whiskers twitched and trembled. There were cracker crumbs on his head. He was a squirrel. Could he be a superhero too? Alfred T. Slipper was a janitor. Most of the time people looked right past him. Sometimes, often in fact, they treated him with disdain. They had no idea of the astonishing acts of heroism, the blinding light contained within his outward, humdrum disguise. Only Alfred Parakeet Dolores knew who he was and what he could do. "The world will misunderstand him," said Florida. "You bet it will," said Mrs. Tickman. "Tootie," shouted Mr. Tickman from the back door. "Tootie, I'm hungry." Tootie? That was a ridiculous name. Flora couldn't resist the urge to say it out loud. "Tootie," she said. "Tootie Tickman. Listen, Tootie, go inside, feed your husband, say nothing to him or anyone else about any of this." "Right," said Tootie. "Say nothing to Fred, my husband." "Okay, right." She began walking slowly toward the house. Mr. Tickman called out, "Are you done vacuuming? What about the Ulysses? Are you going to leave it sitting there?" "Ulysses?" whispered Florida. She felt a shiver run down the back of her head to the base of her spine. She might be a natural-born cynic, but she knew the right word when she heard it. "Ulysses," she said again. She bent down, held out her hand to the squirrel. "Come here, Ulysses," she said. And that's the end of the chapter. So next week, we will read chapter 9, which is The Whole World on Fire. Look how cute. She's holding Ulysses the squirrel. Okay, well, I hope you're enjoying the book, and next week we will start again. I will see you soon. Please come to the library, check out any book you want. And if you're enjoying this book, Flora and Ulysses, let me know at jhaws@solvingschool.org. Thanks, bye.